It was the winter of 1979, and I was a drama student when I first read Ntozake Shange's book, For Coloured Girls Who Have Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough. I'd never read anything like it before, and it simply took my breath away. Page 4, Dark Phrases. Lady in Brown. Somebody, anybody, sing a black girl song. Bring her out to know herself, to know you, but sing her rhythms. Sing her song of life. She's been dead so long, closed in silence so long. She doesn't know the sound of her own voice, her infinite beauty. She's half notes scattered without rhythm, no tune. Sing her sighs, sing the song of her possibilities, sing a righteous gospel, the maken of a melody. Let her be born, and handled warmly. For Coloured Girls consists of 20 poetic monologues centred on 7 black female characters. Each woman is identified by a colour: lady in red, lady in blue, lady in yellow. It's actually an experimental play that was first performed in a women's bar in California in 1974, before ending up on Broadway and in the West End, but it also works brilliantly as a freestanding poetry book. My encounter with For Coloured Girls was timely. I had grown up mixed race in a suburb of London with my Nigerian father and English mother, and other than my immediate family, the world I knew was an almost exclusively white one. I was at the Rose Bruford College of Speech and Drama, studying on the groundbreaking Community Theatre Arts course, which had been set up to train actors to create their own theatre. To my amazement, there were 4 other black women training with me, at a time when most drama schools were loath to let even one student of colour through their doors. Naturally, we 5 women gravitated towards each other and discussed the race and gender we embodied. I found myself getting angry at the white cultural bias of my upbringing and the racism endemic in British society. Angry at my father, too, for not passing on his Yoruba culture and being such a tough, uncommunicative disciplinarian. With hindsight, I understand that I was going through a typical coming-of-age period, one that, thankfully, only lasted a few years. I was a teenager. I was young, although I felt so adult, of course. My anger simmered as I became acutely aware that we black women had no voice in this society. We were invisible. It's not so surprising that For Coloured Girls struck such a chord with me. Here was theatre that spoke to and about black women. We were no longer invisible, but centre stage and owning it. The stories these 7 characters told were urgent. Tales of betrayal and rejection, history and identity, sex and seduction, rape and abortion. This was not that long after the civil rights and women's liberation movements of the 60s and 70s, and Shange was part of a generation of young black women starting to carve out a creative space for themselves that had not existed before. Page 49, Lady in Green. Somebody walked off with all of my stuff. Not my poems or a dance I gave up in the street, but somebody walked off with all of my stuff. Like a kleptomaniac working hard and forgetting while stealing. This is mine. This ain't your stuff. Now why don't you put me back and let me hang out in my own self? Somebody almost walked off with all of my stuff and didn't care enough to send a note home saying I was late for my solo conversation or 2 sizes too small for my own tacky skirts. What can anybody do with something of no value on a open market? Did you get a dime for my things? Hey man, where are you going with all of my stuff? This is a woman's trip and I need my stuff. I always had a strong sense of self, even during the years when I was the only black child in my grammar school of 500 girls. I was never bullied at school and I always had friends, but I knew I was different. Other than the visual evidence, I couldn't help but feel it. I grew up with both my parents, who were very strong individuals and who passed this on to me. My mother married my Nigerian father in 1955, in spite of her family's opposition, and some of them subsequently ostracised her for life. And my father, who had arrived in Britain in 1949 to encounter extreme hostility, always took on all comers, on the street, in local Labour Party politics, and as a trade union shop steward. Local yobs used to smash our windows on a regular basis. My father slept with a hammer by his bed. We were the bogey family in the street. Yes, I had issues. Until I read For Coloured Girls, I had no black role models in theatre. Trawling through the shelves of my college library in 1979, I found no black plays. I began to visit Sister Wright Bookshop on Upper Street in Islington that was devoted to women's literature. I gorged on the poetry and novels of African-American women writers. They weren't speaking about me, but they were speaking to me as fellow black women. But it was For Coloured Girls that became the template for myself as an actress and theatre maker. What I loved about this book was the power and beauty of its language. There was nothing didactic or crude about these poems. They were intense, concise and passionate, musical and sometimes playful, and soaked in wonderful imagery and written with a strong flavour of African-American vernacular. Page 23, Sechita. Lady in Purple. Once there were quadroon balls, elegance and St. Louis, lace mulattoes, gambling down the Mississippi to Memphis, New Orleans and ochre crepes near Bayou, where the poor white trash would sing, moan in strange liquid tones through the swamps. Sechita had heard these things. She moved as if she'd known them. The silver and high-toned laughing, the violins and marble floors. Sechita pushed the clinging delta dust with painted toes. The patchwork tent was polka-dotted. Stale light snatched at the shadows. Creole Carnival was playing Natchez in 10 minutes. Her splendid red garters, gin-stained and itchy on her thigh, black diamond stockings darned with yellow threads. An old starched taffeta can fell abundantly orange from her waist. It struck me that the writer wasn't trying to shape her creativity to fit within traditional theatre structures and strictures, nor was there a sense that her work was written for mainstream approval. Here was a woman resolutely writing about her community in the best way that suited her. She was forging her own path, creating something new. At drama school, I began writing poetry theatre too, hugely shaped by For Coloured Girls. It wasn't forced, though. It came naturally. While Shange was a primary influence, I had also been raised on a diet of Shakespeare, Tennyson, the Bible and the Catholic Church, to which I was frog-marched every Sunday for 10 years of my childhood. The sermons, the high mass, the intoning. And I loved Dylan Thomas's verse radio drama Under Milkwood. At 14, I had played Captain Cat in the school play, with a big white beard and cod Welsh accent, and with applause ringing in my ears, realised I wanted to become an actress. Applause and praise, so seductive. At Rose Bruford College, we 5 black women created a show called, I'm embarrassed to say, Coping. Hey, we were kids. We looked at the lives of 5 black British women. I guess this was the imitation stage. I can't remember much about the show, which is probably just as well, but we did start giving paid performances outside of college. And so, in 1982, when I left drama school, I became a founding member of a theatre company, along with fellow students Patricia St. Hilaire and Paulette Randall. We called it Theatre of Black Women, and it was the first black women's theatre company in this country. Its bold, uncompromising name spelt out our intentions. This is who we are, and this is what we are going to do. At that time, there were few roles for black women on stage or on the screen, and none that appealed to me, namely prostitute, cleaner, cook, and, further up the socio-economic scale, nurse. We wanted to create our own dramatic roles, to speak for our multiple selves from the inside. We knew that if we didn't do it ourselves, no one would do it for us. Page 13. Lady in Red. Without any assistance or guidance from you, I have loved you assiduously for 8 months, 2 weeks and a day. I have been stood up 4 times, I've left 7 packages on your doorstep, 40 poems, 2 plants and 3 handmade note cards. I left town so I could send, to you have been no help to me. On my job, you call at 3 in the morning on weekdays, so I could drive 27.5 miles across the bay before I go to work. Charming, charming, but you are of no assistance. Theatre of Black Women's first public outing consisted of 3 short one-woman plays that we took to a women's theatre festival at the Melkweg in Amsterdam in 1982. My play was a bit of a rant, from what I recall, a long poem using a lot of imagery to temper the rage. It was called Tiger Teeth Clench Not to Bite, which says it all. Theatre of Black Women toured nationally and internationally until 1988. Other writers, actors and directors became involved in the company, but in the spirit of Shange, every play continued to be experimental, preferring visual symbolism, movement and poetry to traditional British theatre. This exploration of form and content carried through to my later published writing career, which includes 2 verse novels, 1 novel with verse, as well as more straightforward books of poetry and fiction. Shange showed me how to have a voice in theatre, even though hers was not mine. Canonical or establishment British writers couldn't reach me at that stage in my life. I didn't want to hear any more of what they had to say. I wanted the alternative, the underground, the subversive, the outsider voice. It was a necessary rite of passage. Shange's voice was American. Lush, evocative, exotic, seductive, sassy. Yep, all those quadroons, crackers and rhinestones etching the corners of her mouth. Mine was British. Flat, unexotic, suburban, grammatically correct, boring. Or so I thought, intimidated by the majesty and visceral power of Shange's poetry. I didn't have the swamps of St. Louis or the banks of the Mississippi to play with, but in my early 30s I began to find my voice and wrote about my family history in my polyvocal, semi-autobiographical verse novel, travelling from slavery in Brazil 150 years ago, colonial Nigeria, 19th century Ireland and Germany, and following the trails of various family members throughout 20th century London. Finding your voice and speaking out were very popular expressions in the 1980s. If you had a voice, you were validated, acknowledged, included. Having a voice as a writer meant having a presence, a public identity. You exist and you have something to say that is heard, if lucky, around the world. Page 36. I used to live in the world. Lady in Blue. I used to live in the world. Then I moved to Harlem, and my universe is now 6 blocks. When I walked in the Pacific, I imagined waters ancient from Accra, Tunis, cleansing me, feeding me. Now my ankles are coated in grey filth from the puddle near the hydrant. I don't regret my coming-of-age period. It made me who I am. I do regret being a bit up myself, high up on the pedestal of my victimhood, damning those who failed me, who didn't deliver, who simply didn't understand. I learned to stop blaming, which is a useless endeavour, and to take responsibility, and I haven't had a stand-up row for decades. Forming Theatre of Black Women was an act of self-empowerment, an act of taking control of our artistic practice from conception to delivery. For Coloured Girls was the model for this.